We've been looking the past couple of weeks at the time between the Testaments, and we are going to put a bow on that today, and we're going to focus most of our attention this morning on this, what we call the intertestamental period, the time between the Old and the New Testament, with particular emphasis this morning on the Jewish people. Okay? We have been seeing the prophecies about them in the book of Daniel and what God would be doing. He's going to bring His kingdom into the world, and how all of that is going to play out. That's what we're focusing on this morning. So as you're looking at your handout there, this period, this intertestamental period, some people call it the period of biblical silence. It's a time period of about 400 years between the chronological close of the Old Testament and when John the Baptist comes on the scene. You have had some Jews who have returned to the area of Judah and Jerusalem. That first group coming back with Ezra numbered about 50,000, and then you have more after that. But then you've got many Jews who opted to remain wherever it is that they had been displaced, whether that be areas of Babylon, areas of Persia, places like that. We talked about you have three main returns to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel, under Ezra, and under Nehemiah. And they began the process of rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the walls, and rebuilding and repopulating the city of Jerusalem. When all of this effort, the rebuilding of the temple, the rebuilding of the walls, all of that, is going to happen during the reign of the Persians. Okay? Think back to Daniel 2 and Daniel 8. Daniel 2 is Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the statue. Daniel 8. Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 are the beasts. All of those, chapter 7 and chapter 2, are divided into fours. We're talking about four different world empires, four different subsequent world empires. And in both Daniel 7 and Daniel 2, who was the first world empire? Babylon, right? Daniel chapter 2, you, O King Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. After you shall arise another kingdom inferior to you, then a third, and then in the time of the fourth kingdom, God will establish what? He will establish His kingdom that will never be destroyed. All right, so four world empires. It's going to be during the time of that second world empire that this period of rebuilding is going to happen. Look, for example, in your Old Testaments, look to the book of Ezra. Look at the book of Ezra. Right after 2nd Chronicles. Second Chronicles will end verse 23, the very last verse of 2nd Chronicles. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth the Lord God of heaven has given to me, and He has commanded me to build Him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is among you of all of His people? May the Lord His God be with him, and let him go up. And of course, the book of Ezra is going to begin with those same exact words. Israel had been in Babylonian captivity. The Babylonian captivity is now ending with Cyrus's decree for the Jews, whatever wanted to return home and begin the work of rebuilding the temple. Eventually, the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire, is going to be overtaken by what world power? By the Greeks, that's right. The Greeks are going to overtake the Persians. And who is it that's going to be leading the Greeks as they overrun the Medo-Persian Empire? It's going to be Alexander the Great, that's right. Around 335, Greece begins to challenge Persia. Alexander is traveling through areas of the Persian Empire, conquering different areas of it. Tyre, Sidon, places like that. And he comes down to Jerusalem, and this is historical account. He comes to Jerusalem, but something strange happens. The people are not arrayed for battle. He does not immediately begin attacking the city, the walls, whatever might have been standing at that time. Instead, what meets Alexander? Who meets Alexander?
The priest.
Yeah, the priests come out, and the people behind him, and they're dressed in white. And rather than fighting against Alexander, what do? They welcome him. Now, that's a strange reaction for any sort of nation, powerful or weaker, to have as an approaching warlord infringes on your territory. But why do they do that?
They read Daniel to him.
They've understood what God has said through Daniel. That's right. And so they come out to Alexander and they read to Alexander the prophecies that had been written concerning the Greeks. And I think the specific reference here would probably be Daniel chapter 8. Look over at Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8. Coming on the heels of Daniel 7, where you have the four different beasts. Then in Daniel chapter 8, you have a focus on two different animals. This is the one that we've talked about a couple of times the past couple of weeks. This is our goat and our... Don't say. Or our ram, yeah. Also ram or a goat, or a ram and a... That's how you'll remember it. That's right. The ram and the unicorn, right? Okay? And they run, they fight against each other. The ram is knocked down, and the goat prevails over the ram. And in the process, the goat's horn breaks. Four little horns arise in its place. And as you come towards the end of Daniel chapter 8, in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 20, we don't have to guess about it. Who is the ram? Kings of Media and Persia. And who is the goat?
Greece.
The goat is Greece, and the horn that is between its eyes is its first king. Here's the point. The people have read, and the priest has read, what God had revealed through his servant Daniel. And they have been able, like we are called today, to put the pieces together and to understand things. And so as Alexander approaches, what do the Jewish people realize? Why fighting? Because what?
He's a fulfillment of prophecy.
This is how God has ordered things. So give them some credit. What have the Jews begun to do now?
Put two and two
Put
together.
pieces together.
Yeah, they've started to learn. They have started to learn lessons that they should have learned long ago. Remember, when Nebuchadnezzar came in, what did quite a lot of the Jews decide to do when the Babylonians were encroaching on Jerusalem? Do you remember?
Go to Egypt.
They fled to Egypt when they had been specifically instructed to do what?
Give up.
Don't go to Egypt. Submit to Babylon, learn your lesson in the captivity, and then I'll restore you. I'll make you whole. I'll take care of you, God said. Here we are some 200 years later, and they've learned the lesson.
Showing obedience.
They're showing obedience. They are being just exactly the kind of people that Daniel, later in the book of Daniel, prays for them to be. Right? That they would have hearts that would be open and receptive to what God says. So, now, here comes Alexander, and instead of fighting against him, they've understood what God has revealed, and they welcome him. And because of that, how does Alexander treat them? Well, he doesn't kill them. There's something to be said for that, right? He doesn't kill them, doesn't destroy them. They get to exist to some degree peacefully. Alexander then will die. His kingdom is going to divide just as Daniel chapter 8 spoke to. And whenever you have no legitimate heir and a scramble for things, what's going to happen in a nation? You're going to have turmoil. You're going to have fighting. You're going to have wars. And that's exactly what happens here in the kingdom of Greece. Two of the kingdoms within the Greek Empire become powerful. You've got the Seleucid kingdom to the north and the Ptolemaic kingdom of the south. And so as you're going to go through Daniel 10 and Daniel 11, even some of, I think Daniel 12 a little bit, you're going to see references to the north and the south, kings of the north, kings of the south. And these are references to the kingdoms, if you can call it that, the fiefdoms of the generals of Alexander who have taken over the divvied up Greek Empire. They're going to fight each other for a while, but then they're going to realize that they've got a common enemy who's really gaining steam on the other side. And who is that? It's going to be Rome. And while it's not mentioned specifically by name in the book of Daniel, we did, and we pointed this out last week, we've got the references to ships from Kittim, ships from the west, ships from Cyprus. All of those, of course, where the book of Daniel is based. If you're moving to the west, if you're going over towards Cyprus, of course, what kingdom is that going to be? That's going to be Rome, right? And so they find this common enemy in Rome, and they're going to fight against it. And of course, who's going to win that battle? Rome will. Okay, but we get a little bit ahead of ourselves right there. The Seleucids are going to be the ones who are going to take control of the areas of Judah and Jerusalem. And Daniel chapter 11 talks about this. They make things difficult for the Jews who were living in the land of their fathers. And during this time period, you have a very notable character in history, at least in Jewish history, who's going to usurp the Seleucid throne. And that's a guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes. He's going to come to the throne, and he is going to start a terrible campaign against the Jews. In chapter 11 and verse 28 of Daniel, I think you've got a reference to him here. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, and so he shall do damage and return to his own land. Well, what damage does he do? Well, he's going to torture some of the people of Israel, of Judah. He's going to reward the ungodly. Chapter 11, verse 30, we'll talk some about that. He's going to defile the temple. This is one of the very notable things that Antiochus Epiphanes does. You have some discussion sometimes in the book of Daniel about ending the practice of sacrifice in the temple. And there are questions about what exactly that might mean and what that might look like. I think Antiochus Epiphanes is one instance of this happening. And what history tells us he does is, as he is engaged in this brutal campaign against the Jews, he comes into the temple, or he sends his delegates into the temple with a pig. And they sacrifice the pig on the altar there at Jerusalem. And of course, in the Jewish mind, what's the significance of that? Pig is an unclean animal, right? It's going to be the animal pictured by Jesus in the story of the prodigal son, right? To show just the degree of degeneracy that the young man had sunk to. There is perhaps no worse thing you could do to a temple than to do that in the Jewish mind. Antiochus Epiphanes does that. He defiles the temple in that way. In that way, he puts a stop to sacrifice. The temple has been polluted now. And there is some indication that he also erected an altar to Zeus and placed that within the temple. You know, something like that had been done previously by Manasseh, but here we are later in history, and this action is being repeated. And so, if you are a Jew, how do you feel about that? This is your Sunday morning softball question here. How do you feel about that? You feel bad about that. That's right. You don't feel good about that. And so, these are the kinds of acts that despots and warlords think are going to play really well to their audience, but they sometimes neglect to consider, what is this going to do to the opposition? It's going to what? It's going to embolden them. It's going to psych them up. It's going to give them something to fight for. And on the scene after this comes a man by the name of Judas Maccabeus. And if that name sounds familiar, in some of the Bibles that bring in the Apocrypha, the Deuterocanonical books, maybe you've heard of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. These kind of possibly historical books, not inspired, but giving historical record to some of the events of the Jews during this intertestamental period. Judas Maccabeus is of that family. He is nicknamed the Hammer, and he begins a series of revolts in response to the actions of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Greeks. And like we said, you've got this internal turmoil boiling here now with the Jews. You've got problems throughout the kingdom elsewhere. And then we've got the ships from Kittim. We've got the ships from the west to worry about. All of that is going to come to a head. And eventually what's going to happen to the Greek Empire? It's going to fall. And it's going to fall to Rome.
You could almost say they had a three-front war.
Yeah, they did. And those typically don't go very well in history. So Rome prevails and begins its reign, and it's even holding on to this parcel of land in Judea. Chapter 11 of Daniel and verse 41, talking about these ships from the west. He shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand: Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. So here are the Romans, and they're coming in now to Jerusalem and holding this territory. And why is that significant? Why is it significant that now, towards the end of the book of Daniel, we've got Rome that's going to be holding the land of Jerusalem? Pardon? Here's our fourth empire. Right, we've gone Babylon. If we're just going straight from the book of Daniel, we've gone from Babylon to Medo-Persia. We've gone from Medo-Persia to Greece, and we've gone from Greece to Rome. That gives us 1, 2, 3, 4. And back in Daniel 2, God had said, in the days of those kings, God's going to set up his kingdom that's never going to be destroyed. So as we get to the end of the book of Daniel, what Daniel is prophesying about, he's prophesying about the time period now where God's kingdom is going to be established. So if we peg this down and we're seeing this as Rome, what are we looking for during the time of the Roman Empire? Yeah, we're looking for Messiah to come, and we're looking for this kingdom of the Messiah to be established. All right, so that kind of gets us up to the New Testament. Now, some things that I wrote down that I wanted to talk about. That period of time where the Greeks are in power over Judah and Jerusalem. What's another name for the Greek people? Perhaps the Hellenists. We talk about the Hellenistic period in history, okay? And you've got the Hellenization of the world at this time, right? You've got the Greek influence spreading over the world. Well, who does that not sit well with? Why would the Jews push back against the Hellenization of the world? What would be involved in the Hellenization of the world, Rod?
All sorts of things.
Yes.
Idolatry.
Idolatry is a big one. And why do the Jews have such a hang-up about idolatry? It cost them their homeland. They have learned the lesson now. It has taken them centuries, but they have learned the lesson. Idolatry equals bad. And so if there's one sin that they are not prone to go back to, it's going to be the sin of what? Idolatry. So when Hellenization sweeps the world and they're trying to usher in idolatry, how does that sit with the Jews? Not well. That's right. There's your softball. Okay. What else is a part of this Hellenization of the world?
It had something to do with language, too.
Language. And maybe the Jews would push back on that some. Maybe they wouldn't. The book of Daniel is written in both Hebrew and Aramaic, so maybe we don't push back so much on the language.
The philosophies,
A philosophy that tends to exclude an almighty God. Okay? Rod?
Just the day-to-day culture.
The sexual mores and norms.
There's a
Right.
line in one of the Maccabee books, I think, that I really get a They just did not go over well with them. This was about to address the games
Yes.
and the way the games were played and the fact that the men played in the nude and that then had Jewish men trying to undo circumcision so they wouldn't be laughed at by the Greek men. I mean, it snowballs. It's just all sorts
Exactly. And so, we even think of things like that in our own culture today when we're facing a push from the world to become more like the world or to conform to the world. Sometimes some people don't see it as quickly and as clearly as others. Sometimes there are some who see it immediately, right? Those are the voices of wisdom, generally.
What he's talking about, is that also talked about like the Spartan life, how they take their children at like 12 and put them into the armies and put those in
That
the
could be
army?
part of it. That could be part of it, yes. So, some realize it early on, and what do? You realize there is this ungodly, what you perceive as an ungodly influence that's coming in,
You isolate yourself.
that's starting to influence, your nation. So one response is to isolate yourselves. What's another response you could take?
Isn't that kind of where they came up with a lot of these hedge laws? of
Okay, and
like
who
going
came up with the
above
hedge
and
laws?
beyond? The priests, when they're
No.
coming. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Go
There it
ahead.
is, the
Specifically,
Pharisee.
Yeah.
And this is the point I wanted us to get to. Who's coming into existence at this time of Greek power over the world? It's the Pharisees, and they're originally going to come in with a general thought process of, here is this invading thought process, the Hellenization of the world. We see the dangers that this poses. We're going to push back on this. And seemingly, to a degree, it's going to begin with good intentions. We're going to come up with some of these laws, and Brother Roach, whether we're coming up with these laws ourselves or whether this is part of this oral tradition that we may think have come down from Mount Sinai, we're going to push back against this. And here are these laws. In addition to what's written down, here are these laws that we think people need to live by. Many of those laws have been good things to push back against Hellenization? Perhaps. Might some of these things have been really good ideas? Possibly. But were these ideas the same thing as the laws of God? No, and here comes the problem, and something we need to be aware of as well, that over centuries, what these people intended to be good ideas to stop the influence of Hellenization eventually get codified into law. And at times, Matthew 15, for instance, are not seen as equivalents to God's law, but are seen as superseding the laws of God. And that's where we get into some trouble. Brother Roach.
Yeah. In vain do you worship? Do they worship me? Transgressing the commandment of God for the sake of their traditions.
Right. Exactly. Very good. So you have the Pharisees who begin at this time period. And if we're talking about isolationism, now the answer to this one is not the Sadducees. But if we're talking about isolationism, there's kind of a third marginal group of the Jews that really don't get a lot of play in the New Testament. But they're here at this time period kind of coming into existence. Who are they? Starts with an E. The Essenes. The Essenes. They are more of the isolationists. And between the Pharisees and the Essenes, you also have now you can say it. Now you've got the Sadducees, right? And the Sadducees were Sadducee because... You guys don't remember this? This is how you remember the difference in the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees were Sadducee because they don't believe in the resurrection. You will remember that for the rest of your lives. You will remember nothing else from this Bible class. You'll remember that.
Is this also the time of the synagogue method of education?
From what I understand, that's when around this time period.
But, the Bible doesn't really speak about that, but it must have been sometime during this period that it's established by
Yep.
the New Testament.
It's thriving in New Testament times. It seems to come about from a separation from the temple. So whether this is Babylonian captivity or shortly thereafter, this is where it all is seeming to come into existence, right? The Sadducees come into existence, and while we often define the difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees as one believes in the afterlife and the resurrection and one does not, of course there's much more to it than that. Brother Roach, do you remember what the big difference was between the Pharisees and the Sadducees?
Well, the Sadducees embraced Hellenistic culture.
They do to some degree, eventually. Right? I'm waiting, or are you saying something else? I didn't want to rush you.
I was about to, but I'll probably get myself in trouble.
Okay, well then, I'll get in trouble for you.
They were friends of Rome.
They end up being more of a political group than the Pharisees, who tend to be a more grassroots group. And one of the defining differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees is this oral Torah that we talk about. The idea that in addition to the law of Moses, there were some spoken requirements that were given at Sinai or shortly thereafter that are not recorded for us, but they were spoken, and that became part of God's law. The Pharisees said, hey, that's a thing and we need to submit to that. The Sadducees said, no, what we must submit to are the laws of God as they are written. So you've got the question of a written canon versus a spoken oral tradition or law. And that really is the division, the main division between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees accepted the oral Torah, the Sadducees rejected the oral Torah. We mentioned Judas Maccabees earlier. Okay? Around 130 BC, so Judas Maccabees is going to be in the 160s BC. Okay? So about 150 years before John the Baptist, you have Judas Maccabees leading this revolt against Greek influence. About 30 years before him, you have this guy by the name of John Hyrcanus. He is also a notable person in Jewish history. He's going to be one of the zealot leaders. He plays some role in pushback against Greek influence, but he's also going to play a large role in pushing back against a subset of Jewish people that were marginalized back then and marginalized even as you come into the New Testament. Who are these people? What was this? Who? The Samaritans. Okay, the Samaritans. Now, we come into the New Testament and we pick up pretty quickly this antipathy between Jews and Samaritans, right? John chapter 4, Samaritan woman at the well. Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. Luke chapter 10, the story of the Good Samaritan who is juxtaposed with a priest and a Levite, right? The Samaritans were looked down on. Why are the Samaritans looked down on?
Illegitimate.
Okay, they're viewed as illegitimate. Why are they viewed as illegitimate? Why are they, okay, mixed race in what sense? They interbred. So Mount Gerizim is going to be important.
They were the people that were brought into Samaria by the Assyrians, and they came from the region around Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
They were really Babylonians, if you will.
Yeah.
If you remember the story in the Old Testament, they were getting eaten up by lions.
Mm-hmm.
And so they said, send us a priest.
Mm-hmm.
They sent a priest of God there who taught them about God and taught them about the law of Moses. And they had a means of worship that was based on the law of Moses.
Okay, there you go.
But it wasn't really pure.
Right, because, so as we're tracing out the Jews in the intertestamental period, because this is what you wanted to do on a Sunday morning. No, I'm just kidding. This helps set the stage for the New Testament. You got the Pharisees who cling to this oral tradition. Okay? You've got the Sadducees who say, no, the only thing we're going to follow is what God has revealed in his word, the writings of Moses and the prophets. And then you've got the Samaritans who are different than the Sadducees and the Pharisees, who say, we're only going to follow what, Jim?
Well, we're going to follow the traditions of the law of Moses as we learned it.
Pentateuch.
The Pentateuch.
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's it. And that's the law of Moses, because that's what Moses wrote, and that's all.
They may have intermarried some, but for the most part, they were Babylonians.
Yeah. People who either were left behind by the Assyrians, the runts of the people who were left behind by the Assyrians, or people who had been repopulated and resettled by the Assyrians into the land of Israel. They are looked down upon by their Jewish brethren as being illegitimate people. They are illegitimate people who do not follow the law of Moses like the Pharisees do, like the Sadducees do, like the Essenes do, like anybody in Judah does. These guys only believe in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and that's it. So, you've got two people who don't get along. You've got brothers who don't get along. And so what do?
They fight each other.
They fight each other. Very good. They fight each other. And so, in 130 BC, the Samaritans had a temple where, Chris? Mount Gerizim, and this is, of course, what Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well talk about. You Jews say Jerusalem is the place to worship, and she says we Samaritans worship at the mountain. And when she says mountain, she's kind of pointing towards Mount Gerizim, where they had had a temple at one point. But what had John Hyrcanus, the Jew, done to the Samaritan temple? Tore it down, destroyed it. Okay? So about 130 years later, this is going to be in about AD 5, AD 6. Okay? So really setting the stage here for the Good Samaritan story and for the conversation with the Samaritan woman. What did the Samaritans do back to the Jews in AD 5? Now they're not going to destroy the Jewish temple. What are they going to do to it?
Desecrate it.
They're going to desecrate it. Now, they're not going to be able to get a pig in there like Antiochus Epiphanes did, but they do get human bones in there. And if the historical records are to be believed, they bring human bones into the temple there at Jerusalem and attempt to defile it in that way. Of course, how do these things go? Poorly for all involved, and we end up with Jews and Samaritans already disliked each other. And now we're attacking each other's centers of religious observation. So now we what? Now we hate each other. And that's how you get John 4, the woman saying to Jesus, why are you talking to me? Number one, I'm a woman, and number two, I'm a Samaritan, and Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Well, because they destroyed each other's, desecrated and defiled and destroyed each other's temples and things like that. Yes, Christy?
Was it part of what started this? The Samaritans decided to change their own Ten Commandments, and they made one of them, I guess it's the 10th commandment, that thou shalt worship only on Mount Gerizim.
I have heard something like that, yeah.
This argument back and forth about which
I have heard something like that. So that could very well be part of all of this as well. Okay. Check. Okay. Last little bit here. Fast forward. Out of the Greek period into the Roman period. Rome is now taken over. Okay? Jerusalem's a long way from Rome. And so, if you're going to be an empire ruling over this far-flung outpost, what do you need? Local government. And so, we're searching out for local people who can do this work, and we find what family? The Herods. Herod is not a first name. Herod is a family name. Okay? So when you're reading about the Herods, it's one family. Reverse it, I'm Tyler Sams, and Sams is my family name, right? That's how we do it in our American style. We're doing it the opposite way here in the first century. Your family name comes first, the Herods. So, we start with Herod the Great. Herod the Great is going to be the ruler. Get up there. There we go. Herod the Great is going to be the ruler when Jesus is born. He starts his reign here somewhere around 40 BC. And his reign is going to conclude around 4 BC. right? And understanding that Jesus was most likely born somewhere around 5 BC, Jesus is going to be born here during the time frame of Herod the Great. And of course, what is he known for?
Killing children.
Yeah, what a wonderful thing to be known for. Right? Hey, what are you known for? Massacring children 2 years and under. Right? And by the way, just throwing this in for free, some people say, you know what, if Herod has this massive campaign and is just indiscriminately slaughtering children 2 years and under all across his empire, why don't we read anything about it? Which is a common argument from our more atheist and agnostic friends, and kind of they perceive it as a mic drop moment. Number one, does anywhere in the text or any document reveal that this was something that was done throughout the entire empire? No. Okay? Secondly, it seems to be localized, and it seems to be, as we read through the nativity story, based upon the prophecies that are found in the Old Testament. Can you think of an Old Testament prophecy that talks about where the Messiah was going to be born?
Bethlehem.
Micah 5. Bethlehem Ephratah, right? I think that's Micah 5 and verse 2. Herod being instructed by the wise men, being instructed by the writings that they had, he doesn't have to destroy children everywhere. He just has to destroy them where? Bethlehem. And if we're talking about a rule that ultimately has to be approved by Rome, but you're talking about some little backwater, podunk town, village, right? Where if you're going to slaughter, I mean, you're not talking on the orders of millions here, or even hundreds of thousands.
10 or 20.
You very well could be talking in the tens or in the low hundreds, right?
And also, because of the way they communicated, they could probably keep it very quiet to a certain
Exactly.
degree.
There's nothing that indicates that this was something that was done throughout the entirety of the Roman Empire, or even throughout the entirety of Judea, right? But here's what Herod is known for: the slaughter of the innocents, 2 years old and younger. And of course, when Joseph is made aware about this, what does he do with Mary and Jesus?
Egypt.
Flees to Egypt, okay? And who's going to reign? After Herod the Great dies, who comes to the throne? Why? Our very good friend Archelaus. Herod Archelaus. I'm mispronouncing that, but that's how I've always said it. He's going to come to the throne. Matthew chapter 2 is going to note this. Herod the Great dies. Herod Archelaus comes to the throne. And here is Herod Archelaus. He is known to be tyrannical and brutal, so Joseph is from Bethlehem. He's not going to return to Bethlehem, though. He's going to go where? He's going to go to Nazareth, where it seems like either Philip the Tetrarch or Herod Antipas is ruling. All three of these guys are ruling at the same time. Archelaus, Antipater, and Philip are all ruling at the same time. They just have different areas of Judea that they're ruling. Antipater is the one who's going to kill John the Baptist on the orders of his wife. Remember her name? Herodias, right? Basically, Mrs. Herod, right? Okay? Herodias, okay? And while Scripture does not supply this name, history does. What is the name of Antipater's daughter who goes and salaciously dances in front of everybody? Salome, right? And Salome is going to end up married to, take a wild guess. He's on the list. Philip the Tetrarch, being only separated in age by a mere 40 years. Philip being the older, right? He's going to rule the area north and east of Galilee. Once these guys finish their reign is more consolidated, and then you've got Agrippa. Here's the confusing part, because you've got two Agrippas. Two Herod Agrippas. Not confusing in the least. Herod Agrippa the first is going to be the one who's going to throw Peter in prison. This is Acts chapter 12. And he's the one who receives glory as though he is God from the adulating crowd. And what happens? He is struck dead and eaten by worms. Every fifth grade boy's favorite Bible story. And then he's going to be succeeded by whom? Herod Agrippa II, who is the Agrippa that we see at the end of the book of Acts, who is involved in the trial of Paul, and to whom Paul makes his appeal to be heard by Caesar. To Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. Herod Agrippa is going to be the longest ruling of these Herods, ruling until about AD 93. And while he is angry and despotic in his own way, he's not quite to the level of some of those who preceded him. That is kind of the intertestamental period. That's what's going on with the Jewish people. They have some degree of self-rule here under the Romans. Here are the guys who are going to be ruling, and when we pick up next week, we're coming into the time frame of John the Baptist. Questions, comments, complaints, concerns, critiques? Rod.
I would just add that Herod Archelaus was such a jerk that the Romans deposed him, and that's where we get the Roman governor from.
Yes, I didn't mention that, did I? Archelaus is the shortest ruling of all of these Herods. He reigns for about 8 years. All the other ones are reigning generally 30 years or so. There's one exception, but most of them reigning 30 years. This guy reigns 8 years, and he is such a jerk that the Romans depose him. They put in a more direct vassal of their own, and we know him as Pontius Pilate.
Tyler, I love how you call historical figures a jerk. I just want to tell you this.
Well, that was Rod. I was just quoting Rod, to be fair. Appreciate your attention this morning. Thanks, guys.